The spear was close enough to my throat that I could feel the heat coming off the metal. 2 guards stood on either side of me, tall creatures with silver skin and eyes like polished stone, and neither of them blinked. The throne room was silent, except for the low hum of the crystal lights above us. I was the only human in a room built for giants. Princess Withrenia Velskarn sat on a throne, carved from a single piece of black stone, her long fingers resting on the armrests like she was already bored of me. She had summoned me here without warning, pulled from my quarters at the embassy in the middle of the night, marched through corridors I had never seen before, and brought straight to her. "You know why you are here," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I have a guess," I said, "but I would rather hear it from you." A ripple went through the room. Advisors standing along the walls shifted, exchanging looks. I understood later that no one spoke to her like that, not even her own people. "Your predecessor," she said, "insulted this court. He refused to kneel during the first contact ceremony. He called it beneath him, to kneel before the rulers of 1,000 worlds." I already knew this story, though I had heard a very different version of it back home. The previous envoy, a quiet man named Callum Price, had not refused to kneel out of arrogance. He had a knee injury from a shuttle accident 2 years earlier. He could not kneel. He had explained this through a translator, and the explanation had apparently never made it past the guards at the door. "With respect," I said, "I think there might have been a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," she said. "There was disrespect. And now Earth owes this court an apology and a correction to the mining agreement in the Varan Belt. You will kneel in his place, human, and you will speak the words of submission, and perhaps I will decide your people are worth trading with after all." I looked at her for a long moment. She was beautiful in the way that ancient things are beautiful, carved and polished and cold. She was also, I realized, testing something much bigger than an apology. She wanted to see what a human would do when cornered. She had probably done this to a dozen other species before me, and every single one of them had bent. "Can I ask you something first?" I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You may ask. If I kneel, and I say the words, what happens to the mining agreement?" "It is renegotiated, in our favor." "And if I don't kneel?" "Then your people lose access to Velinari space entirely. No trade, no protection along the border. Your colonies in the outer systems will be left to whatever comes looking for them." I nodded slowly. It was exactly what I had expected. This was never about an apology. This was a business deal wrapped in ceremony, designed so that no matter what I did, humanity would come out smaller than before. "One more question," I said. She almost smiled. "You are fond of questions. Did Callum Price ever get the chance to explain why he didn't kneel, before you decided he had insulted you?" Silence. A real silence. The kind that spreads and gets heavier. I watched something flicker across her face. Gone before I could name it. "That is not relevant," she said. "I think it's the only thing that's relevant," I said. The guards on either side of me tensed. I felt the spear tip shift a fraction closer to my skin. I kept my hands loose at my sides and my breathing steady, because I had learned a long time ago that the moment you show fear in front of a predator, you have already lost. "You test my patience," the princess said, and for the first time there was an edge under the calm. "Kneel, human. Beg for your people's future, or leave this court with nothing and watch your species crawl back to whatever rock you came from." I thought about my answer for exactly 3 seconds. Not because I was unsure, because I wanted her to see that I was choosing this, not panicking into it. "No," I said. The word landed in that huge stone room like a dropped glass. I saw the advisors along the walls go rigid. I saw one of them actually take a step back, as if the word itself might be contagious. "You refuse the crown," Ythrenia said slowly, like she was testing whether the sentence was even possible to say out loud. "I'm not refusing the crown," I said. "I'm refusing the game. There's a difference. You didn't bring me here for an apology. You brought me here to watch me beg, because that's what you're used to. I understand why. It probably works, most of the time. But it's not going to work on me, and it's not going to work on my people. Not today, not ever. Then you condemn your species to isolation, she said. Do you understand what you are doing? I understand exactly what I'm doing, I said. I'm telling you that humanity doesn't sign treaties written by someone standing on our throat. If you want a trade agreement, you can write one where both sides walk away with something. If all you want is somebody on their knees, you're going to have to find another species for that. We're not available. I turned around. Behind me, the massive doors of the throne room were shut, guarded by 2 more soldiers who looked at their princess, unsure whether to stop me or step aside. I kept walking toward them anyway, my footsteps the only sound in that enormous silent hall. Guards, Ythrenia said, and my heart did one hard, heavy beat. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around. I had made my decision the moment I said no, and turning back now would have undone everything that word meant. Let him go, she said instead. The doors opened. I stepped through them into the corridor beyond, and only once they had closed behind me, sealing that throne room and its stunned silence away from me, did I let myself breathe out slowly, feeling my hands shake just slightly at my sides. I did not know it yet, but I had just done something no one in the history of contact with the Velinari Empire had ever done. I had walked away from their crown princess mid-audience, without kneeling, without apology, without a single word of submission. I did not feel brave. I felt like a man who had just stepped off a ledge without checking how far down the ground was. The corridor outside the throne room stretched long and dim, lit by strips of pale blue light set into the black stone walls. My escort, a silent Velinari officer who had led me in earlier, was waiting exactly where I had left him, arms folded, face unreadable. He said nothing as I approached. He simply turned and began walking, and I followed, my mind still catching up with what my mouth had just done. We passed through 3 checkpoints before reaching the transport bay, where my shuttle waited. At each one, guards who had clearly already heard some version of what happened stared at me a little too long. News in that palace apparently traveled faster than I could walk. I climbed into the shuttle, strapped in, and only once the doors sealed and the engines began their low-charging whine did the shaking really start. Not from fear exactly, from adrenaline and disbelief, and the slow realization that I had just gambled with something far bigger than my own life. I thought about Callum Price, sitting somewhere back on Earth with a knee that never fully healed, carrying the weight of an insult he never meant to give. I thought about every quiet species I had read reports on, the ones who had knelt, apologized, signed away resources and dignity because the alternative seemed unthinkable. And I thought about the look on Ythrenia's face in that last second before the doors closed. Not anger, something closer to confusion. Like she had asked a question she already knew the answer to, and I had given her a different one entirely. The shuttle lifted off, and Velinari City fell away beneath me, all black towers and blue light, a civilization built on the assumption that everyone eventually kneels. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, and for the first time since I had been pulled out of bed hours earlier, I let myself wonder if I had just saved my species, or ended it. By the time I reached the human embassy, the story had already spread through every channel that mattered. My comm unit was flooded before I even sat down. Messages from staff, from other envoys, from people I barely knew asking if it was true. I did not answer any of them yet. I needed a few minutes of quiet before I became the center of something I could not undo. Laura Bennett was waiting for me in the embassy's main hall when I walked in. She ran logistics for our small mission here, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were already in trouble. "Tell me it's not true," she said. "Depends which version you heard," I said. "The version where you told the crown princess of the Velinari Empire no, turned your back on her, and walked out of her own throne room. That one's true." She stared at me for a long moment, then let out a breath that sounded like it had been building since the moment she heard the rumor. "Ethan, do you understand what you might have just done? We are a new species out here. We don't have fleets like theirs. We don't have allies lined up to back us if this goes badly. You didn't just risk your own neck in there, you risked every human colony past the Sol system." "I know," I said, and I meant it. I had thought about nothing else the entire flight back. "Then why did you do it?" I sat down slowly at the long table in the main hall, the same table where we usually reviewed cargo manifests and trade routes, ordinary work that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different life. "Because the deal on the table wasn't a deal," I said. "It was a trap, dressed up as diplomacy. Kneel, apologize, and hand over rights in the Varen Belt, and maybe, if she felt generous, she'd let us keep trading with her empire. That's not a negotiation. That's a leash. So instead, you gave up the negotiation entirely." "I gave up pretending it was one," I said. "There's a difference. If I had knelt, we would have signed something worse than what we had before, and we would have taught every species watching that Earth folds under enough pressure. Every negotiation after that would have started from the same place, us on our knees. I wasn't willing to set that as our first chapter out here." Laura sat down across from me, quiet for a moment, turning something over in her mind. "You might be right," she said finally. "You also might have just handed our entire species over to a war we can't win." "I know that too," I said. Neither of us had a comfortable answer, so we sat there in silence, while the embassy around us kept humming with nervous energy, staff moving faster than usual, voices lower than usual, everyone waiting to see what would come next. What came next, over the following 2 days, was silence from the palace. No formal complaint, no demand for my arrest, no announcement of broken relations. Just silence, which in some ways was more unsettling than anything else could have been. I spent those 2 days trying to understand why. I pulled every record I could access on Velinari diplomatic history, going back as far as our limited archives allowed. Species after species had come through that same throne room. Every single one of them, when faced with an accusation, no matter how small or manufactured, had chosen the same path. Kneel, apologize, sign whatever was placed in front of them. It was not written law as far as I could tell. It was simply what everyone did, because the alternative seemed impossible to imagine. Nathan Hale, the embassy's communications officer and one of the few people I actually trusted out here, found me in the records room late on the second night, surrounded by files. "You're going to wear a hole in that chair," he said, dropping into the seat beside me. "I keep looking for someone who's done what I did," I said. "Anyone, any species, any time. I can't find a single case." "Maybe that's the point," Nathan said. "Maybe nobody's ever thought to try it." "That doesn't make sense to me," I said. "Somebody, somewhere, must have gotten angry enough to walk away." "Angry? Sure," Nathan said. "But angry and walking away are different things. Most species that get angry either fight or fold. You didn't do either. You just left, calmly, like it wasn't even a hard decision." I thought about that. He was right, in a way I had not fully considered. My anger had been there, quiet and steady, but it had not driven the decision. What drove it was something older, something almost boring in how deeply human it was. We walk out of bad deals. We refuse unfair terms even when refusing costs us something. It is such an ordinary part of how we live that I had not even registered it as unusual until I saw the reaction it caused in that room. "Back home," I said slowly, "if your boss tries to force you into a contract you know is unfair, you don't usually beg him to be nicer. You look for another job. You walk out. It's not brave, exactly. It's just what people do when the deal on the table isn't really a deal." "Maybe these people don't have another job to walk to," Nathan said. "Maybe in this part of the galaxy, the Velinari are the only real employer, so to speak. Everyone signs the bad contract because there's no better one waiting." That thought stayed with me long after Nathan had gone to bed. If he was right, then my walking away had done more than just protect Earth's dignity for one afternoon. It had shown every other species watching that there was, in fact, another option. Whether that was a good thing or a terrible thing depended entirely on what happened next. On the third day, word reached us through a trade contact on a nearby station that the story had spread far beyond the palace. Species from 3 different systems were already discussing it, some in disbelief, some with something that sounded almost like hope. A courier from a minor trading league even reached out to our embassy directly, asking, carefully and indirectly, whether humans might be interested in reviewing certain older agreements they had signed with the Velinari under similar pressure. Laura brought me the message personally. "You've started something," she said. "I don't know yet if it's good." "Neither do I admitted. That same evening, an encrypted transmission arrived from Earth Command, routed through 3 relay stations to reach us out here on the edge of Velinari space. I opened it alone, in my quarters, because I had a feeling it was not something I wanted an audience for while I read it. The message was short. It came from Grace Whitfield, one of the senior voices on Earth's Outer Relations Council, a woman known for being blunt, even by the standards of people who had to be blunt for a living. "Ethan," it read, "we have received 3 separate reports describing what happened in the Velinari throne room. Council is divided. Some see this as reckless endangerment of every human colony past the frontier. Others see it as the first real spine Earth has shown since contact began. Both sides agree on one thing. You just made this a great deal harder, or a great deal easier. We do not yet know which. Stand by for further instruction. Do not, under any circumstances, engage further with the Velinari court without direct authorization. That is not a request." I read it twice, then set the device down on the small desk in my quarters and sat there in the low light for a long while. I had known, walking out of that throne room, that I was taking a risk that reached far past myself. What I had not fully understood, not until that message, was how quickly the consequences would ripple outward, catching people in council rooms back on Earth who had never even met me, forcing them into a debate about who we were as a species, based entirely on 3 seconds of my own decision. I thought about Withrenya's face again, that flicker of something unreadable in the last moment before the doors closed. Confusion, maybe, or curiosity. Whatever it was, it had not looked like the face of someone who was simply going to let the matter end there. I did not sleep much that night. I kept turning the message over in my mind, wondering which side of that council debate I had actually strengthened, and which side I had handed a weapon to use against me. 2 days after that, the silence from the palace finally broke, though not in the way any of us expected. The break in silence came in the form of 3 Velinari warships, sliding out of jump space near the edge of the Corvin system, one of our smaller mining colonies close to the border. They did not fire. They did not send a message. They simply sat there, huge and silent, close enough to the colony's orbital lanes that every cargo ship trying to leave had to alter course around them. I got the news from Laura, who burst into my quarters without knocking, which told me everything before she said a word. "They're blockading Corvan," she said, "not attacking, just sitting there, making sure everyone knows they can close that system whenever they want." I felt my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear for myself. Corvan had 4,000 people on it, miners and their families, people who had left Earth for a chance at something better and ended up on the front line of a decision I had made in a throne room none of them had ever seen. "This is on me," I said. "Maybe," Laura said, "or maybe it was always coming, and you just moved the timeline up. Either way, Earth Command wants you on a secure line in 10 minutes. And Ethan, they are not happy." The council meeting was the hardest 10 minutes I had experienced since arriving in Velinari space. Worse than the throne room, because in the throne room, I had at least been certain of what I was doing. Here, listening to 6 angry, frightened faces on a screen, I was no longer certain of anything. General Arik Voss spoke first, his voice tight with the particular anger of a man who had spent his whole career trying to avoid exactly this kind of situation. "You had one job out there, Cole. Represent Earth's interests without giving the Velinari a reason to remind us how small we are. Instead, you turned a routine ceremony into an international incident, and now we have 3 warships parked over a mining colony that has no defenses of its own. "With respect, General," I said. "The ceremony was never routine. It was a setup designed to force us into signing away rights in the Varen Belt as punishment for something we didn't do. Kneeling would have solved nothing. It would have taught them that pressure works on us every time." "And walking out taught them what, exactly?" asked Counselor Owen Marsh, a thin, precise man who rarely raised his voice, which somehow made his questions sting more. "That we're willing to gamble colonies for pride." "It taught them we're not willing to be a client species," I said. "There's a difference between pride and refusing to be owned." "Tell that to the families on Corvin," Voss said. That landed harder than anything else in the meeting, because he was right, and I knew it. Whatever principle I had been defending in that throne room, it was now sitting as 3 warships over people who had never agreed to be part of my decision. "I'm not asking anyone to be comfortable with the risk," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were not entirely steady under the table. "I'm asking you to consider what the alternative actually costs us long-term. If we fold now, every future negotiation with every species out here starts from the same place. Us, kneeling. That's not a one-time cost. That's a debt we'd be paying forever." Grace Whitfield, who had sent me that short encrypted message days earlier, finally spoke, her voice calmer than the others but no less serious. "The Council is split almost exactly down the middle on this, Ethan. Half believe you have created an unacceptable risk. Half believe you may have just given us the only leverage we've had since contact began. Both halves agree that the blockade over Corvin needs to end before we can have any confidence in either position." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Nothing, for now," she said. "Do not attempt further contact with the Velinari court. Do not apologize on Earth's behalf. Do not act. We are exploring diplomatic channels through neutral parties. You will remain at the embassy until further notice." The meeting ended without resolution, which somehow felt worse than if they had simply told me I was wrong. I sat alone in the dim light of my quarters afterward, replaying every word, wondering how many families on Corvin were sitting in their own homes right now, watching those warships through their windows, waiting to see if a decision made light years away by a man they had never met was about to end their lives. Nathan found me there an hour later, the way he seemed to find me whenever the weight of things got too heavy to sit with alone. "You look like a man rethinking his whole life," he said, dropping into the chair across from me. "I keep asking myself if I was right," I said, "and every time I think yes, I picture those 4,000 people on Corvan, and I'm not so sure anymore." "For what it's worth," Nathan said, "I don't think this is really about Corvan. I think Corvan is a message. The Velinari aren't stupid. If they wanted to hurt us, really hurt us, they wouldn't park 3 ships in plain sight and wait. They'd have already done it quietly, somewhere we couldn't trace it back to them. This feels like pressure, not war." "Pressure toward what?" "Toward you," Nathan said, "or toward whatever answer they're trying to get out of Earth. I don't think they know what to do with you either, Ethan. You broke their entire operating manual. My guess is half their court is having the same argument we just had, just with silver skin instead of ours." I wanted to believe him. I was not sure I could yet. 3 days passed with the warships still sitting silently over Corvin, neither advancing nor withdrawing, while Earth's council debated in circles and neutral trade contacts tried quietly to open channels that led nowhere. I spent those days doing the only thing that felt useful, going back through every scrap of Velinari history and culture our archives held, trying to understand the mind on the other side of this standoff. What I found, slowly, painted a picture I had not expected. The Velinari Empire was old, older than almost anything else out here, built across centuries on a foundation of hierarchy so deep it had become invisible to the people living inside it. Species after species had been absorbed into their sphere of influence, not through open conquest, but through exactly what had almost happened to me, staged confrontations designed to end in submission, each one reinforcing the idea that resistance was pointless. It was a quiet, patient kind of empire, one that rarely needed to fire a shot because everyone eventually knelt on their own. which meant that somewhere in that ancient system, my walking away had not just been an insult. It had been a crack in the foundation. I did not know it at the time, but while I sat in the records room piecing together a history of quiet submission, Princess Withrenia was doing something no member of her court had done in living memory. She was studying us back. I learned the details later, pieced together from things Nathan overheard through contacts of his own and things Withrenia herself eventually told me directly. She had pulled every record her intelligence services held on human history, not the polished diplomatic summaries prepared for first contact, but the raw archives, war histories, labor movements, records of ordinary people refusing orders from powerful men throughout centuries of human civilization. She found, buried in all of it, a pattern that unsettled her far more than my walking out of her throne room ever had. Humans did this constantly. We walked away from bad kings, bad employers, bad marriages, bad deals, not because we always won when we did, often we did not, but because something in how we were built simply refused to accept an arrangement that cost us our dignity in exchange for safety. It was not calculated defiance in most cases. It was closer to instinct. For a woman raised inside a system where submission was the only response anyone had ever offered her, this was apparently a very difficult thing to sit with. I found out about the extent of her research when, on the fourth day of the standoff, an unmarked courier ship arrived at our embassy, carrying a single sealed message addressed personally to me, bypassing every official channel entirely. Laura brought it to me with a look of deep suspicion. This came through a private route, not the palace's usual channels, she said. No official seal, just her name. I opened it alone. The message was short, written in careful, formal Velinari script that our translation systems rendered into plain language. It read, "You told me humans do not negotiate with a knife at their throat. I have spent 4 days trying to understand what you meant by that, and I find I cannot, not from records alone. I am withdrawing the ships from your colony as a gesture of good faith while we speak further. I am inviting you back to this court, not as a summoned subject, but as one who might explain himself to me directly, without an audience, without ceremony. Come alone, if you are willing. I give you my word you will leave when you choose, as you did before." I read it 3 times before I fully believed what I was looking at. The warships withdrew from Corvin that same night, exactly as promised, slipping quietly back into jump space as if they had never been there at all. Earth's Council, when they received confirmation, treated it with the same disbelief I felt reading her message. No one, in the entire history of contact, had ever received a personal invitation like that from Velinari royalty. Certainly not one that acknowledged, even indirectly, that the invited guest might have a point worth hearing. Grace Whitfield's response, when it finally came through, was as careful as I expected. "This could be a trap," she said. "It could also be the opening we've been hoping for since contact began. The decision is yours, Ethan, though I suspect you already know that." I sat with the message for a long time that night, turning it over the way I had turned over every decision since walking out of that throne room. I thought about Corvin, about the families who had spent 4 days watching warships through their windows, about the council split so evenly it could not decide whether I was a hero or a liability. And I thought about Withrenia's face in that last moment before the doors closed, the flicker of something that had never quite fit the word anger. I wrote back a single line, "I'll come, alone." The shuttle ride back to Velinari City felt nothing like the first one. That first flight had been fast, urgent, filled with guards who did not speak to me and did not need to. This time I flew in alone, piloting a small courier craft Earth's embassy had cleared for the trip. No escort, no guard, just the long dark stretch of space between our outpost and the black towers of the capital. I kept expecting to feel afraid. Instead, I felt something closer to focus, the same steady quiet that had settled over me in the throne room days earlier. Whatever happened next, I had already made peace with the fact that I could not control it. I could only control how I showed up for it. Landing clearance came through without delay, which surprised me. No inspection, No escort waiting at the gate, just a single door standing open at the edge of the same transport bay I had left from before, quiet and unguarded in a way that felt almost unnatural for a palace this size. I walked the long corridor alone, my footsteps echoing off black stone walls lined with pale blue light, the same path I had walked before, except this time no one led me and no one followed. The throne room doors were already open when I reached them. Inside, the massive space was empty except for one figure standing near the base of the black stone throne, not seated on it this time, dressed simply, without the heavy ceremonial layers I remembered from before. Princess Withrenia Velskarn looked, for the first time since I had met her, less like the ruler of 1,000 worlds, and more like a person standing alone in a very large room, waiting. "You came," she said, as I approached. "You said I would leave when I chose," I said. I figured that included the choice to arrive first. Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I have cleared the court," she said. "No advisors, no guards within these walls. What is said here will remain between us, if that is what you wish." "That's what I wish," I said. She gestured, and we walked together to a smaller space just off the main hall, a room with tall windows looking out over the city, its black towers glowing faintly under a sky I still did not fully understand the color of. There were no thrones here, only simple seats and a low table between them. It was, I realized slowly, the first genuinely private conversation any human had likely ever had with someone of her position. "I spent 4 days," she said once we were seated, "trying to understand why you walked away from me. I read your history, your wars, your labor disputes, your revolutions. I found the same pattern again and again, humans refusing arrangements that cost them their dignity, even when refusing cost them everything else. I do not understand it. I would like you to explain it to me, honestly, without performance, the way you did not perform for me the first time we spoke." I took a moment before answering, because I wanted to give her something true, not something diplomatic. "For us," I said, "dignity isn't something you earn by being useful enough, or humble enough, or grateful enough to whoever holds power over you. It's something you already have, just by existing. When someone tries to take a piece of that away, even in exchange for safety, or trade, or protection, something in most of us refuses the trade automatically, not because we calculated the odds and decided refusing was smart. Sometimes refusing is the opposite of smart. We do it anyway. That is not how power works," she said quietly. "Not anywhere I have known. Power protects those who kneel to it. Those who do not kneel are left exposed." "Sometimes," I said, "sometimes we lose everything for it. My people have plenty of stories like that too, people who refused and paid for it with their lives. But the ones who folded instead, who bent every time the pressure got heavy enough, they didn't end up safer in the long run either. They just ended up smaller, over and over, until there was nothing left to protect." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city beyond the tall windows. "I have ruled beside my mother since I was young enough to remember nothing else," she said finally. "I have watched 100 envoys from 100 worlds sit exactly where you are sitting, and every one of them, when pressed, chose to kneel. I assumed this was simply how intelligent beings behaved when faced with a power greater than their own. I did not consider that it might instead be how beings behave when they have never been shown another option. Now I have watched a species with no fleet to match ours, no empire, barely a foothold past its own solar system, refuse an order from the crown of the Velinari Empire, and walk away unpunished, simply because staying and kneeling was worse to you than any consequence I could threaten." She turned back to face me. "I do not know what to do with that information." "You could start," I said carefully, "by asking what an agreement between equals would actually look like. Not a treaty where one side kneels and the other side dictates terms. Something both sides could walk away from at any point, and both sides would still have reason to want to stay. Such an agreement has never existed in the history of this empire," she said. "Then maybe it's time it did," I said. She studied me for a long moment, and I found myself studying her back, this ruler of 1,000 worlds who had, apparently, spent 4 sleepless nights trying to understand a species she had assumed she already had figured out. "There is something I must ask you," she said finally, "and I would like an honest answer, not the answer you think I want to hear. Go ahead." "When you turned your back on me in that throne room," she said, "you could not have known I would let you leave. My guards were close enough to stop you before you reached the doors. Tell me, human, what would you have done if I had ordered them to strike you down the moment you turned away?" The question hung in the quiet room between us, and I realized this was the real reason she had invited me back, alone, without ceremony. Not to hear an explanation of human philosophy in general terms, to hear, specifically, what had been running through my mind in the exact moment I turned my back on a woman who could have had me killed with a single word. I thought about lying, about giving her some polished answer, about calculated risk and diplomatic law. But I had promised her honesty, and myself, and I found I did not want to break that promise on the one question that actually mattered. "I'll tell you," I said, "but I want you to understand it's not a comfortable answer." "I did not ask for a comfortable one," she said. "I knew Velinari law forbids harming an envoy mid-negotiation," I said. "I had read enough of your own records to know that much before I ever walked into that room. So there was a part of me, the careful part, that believed the odds were in my favor. But I won't pretend that was the whole answer, because it wasn't." "Then what was?" she asked. "The truth is, even if I had believed you might order your guards to strike me down, I still would have turned around and walked toward those doors," I said. "Not because I wanted to die. I didn't. But because kneeling would have meant something worse to me than dying would have. It would have meant telling every human who came after me that this is how it works out here, that we bend when the pressure gets heavy enough. I couldn't be the first chapter of that story. I'd rather have been a short chapter that ended honestly than a long one that started with us on our knees." Ythrenia said nothing for a long moment, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity I had not seen from her before, not even in the throne room. "You understood you might die," she said slowly, "and you walked toward it anyway, for a principle that had not yet been tested, for a species that did not yet know if it would need such a principle." "That's about right," I said. "That is either the bravest thing I have witnessed in my life," she said, "or the most foolish." "Probably both," I said. "Most of the important things people do usually are." She rose from her seat then and walked to the tall window, looking out over the black towers of her city for a long while, before speaking again. "I have ruled beside considerations of strength my entire life," she said. "Strength of fleets, strength of resources, strength of fear. I never once considered that the deepest strength I witnessed in this palace would come from a species with none of those things, standing in a room built to remind everyone how small they are, and simply declining to feel small." "For what it's worth," I said, "I don't think you're weak for how your empire runs. I think you built something that's worked for a very long time, on a foundation that made sense for a very long time. I just don't think it's the only way things can work, and I think somewhere underneath all that fear you've built, some part of you already knew that too. Otherwise you wouldn't have spent 4 days reading human history instead of just sending those warships to finish the point." She turned back to face me, and for the first time since I had met her, the coldness I had seen in the throne room was entirely gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, more genuinely curious than I imagined she had allowed herself to be in a very long time. "I would like to offer something no envoy of any species has ever received from this court," she said. "A treaty, written not as terms of submission, but as terms between equals. Trade that benefits both sides, protection that flows in both directions. An agreement either side may walk away from, should the other prove unworthy of it. I do not know if my own council will accept such terms easily. Many of them believe, as I once did, that strength requires submission from everyone beneath it. But I believe, after these 4 days, that they are wrong, and I intend to prove it." I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the moment I first walked into that throne room, days that felt like months earlier. "I think," I said, That's the best offer anyone from Earth has heard since we first found out we weren't alone out here. We spent the following hours, and then the following days, working through the details of what would become the first agreement of its kind between the Velinari Empire and any species in its sphere of influence. It was not easy. Her council fought it at every step, exactly as she had predicted, arguing that any agreement not built on hierarchy would be seen as weakness by every other species watching. Vrenya held firm, using the very argument I had given her in that quiet room by the windows, that an empire built entirely on fear was an empire one crack away from collapse, and that fear was not the same thing as respect, no matter how similar the two might look from a throne. Earth's council fought their own battles, General Voss in particular, remaining deeply uneasy about trusting a species that had, only days earlier, parked 3 warships over a colony full of civilians as a bargaining chip. Grace Whitfield worked the diplomatic channels with a patience I did not have myself, and slowly, piece by piece, the terms came together. Trade rights in the Varen Belt shared fairly between both parties, mutual defense obligations along the border, binding on both sides equally, and perhaps most remarkable of all, a formal acknowledgement, written into the treaty itself, that Earth entered this agreement as an equal party, not a subject species granted mercy by a superior power. The signing took place 3 weeks later, in the same throne room where I had once stood with a spear close enough to my throat to feel its heat. This time the room was filled not with silent guards waiting for me to kneel, but with representatives from both Earth and the Velinari Empire, standing side by side, an image no one in that ancient system had ever expected to see. What I had not fully anticipated was what happened after. Word of the treaty spread fast, faster even than the original story of my walking out of that same room weeks earlier. Species who had spent generations quietly accepting whatever terms the Velinari offered them began, for the first time, asking questions they had apparently never dared ask before. A trading league from a neighboring system requested a formal review of an old agreement they had signed decades earlier, under circumstances that, once examined closely, looked uncomfortably similar to what had almost happened to me. A smaller species near the border, one that had never sent an envoy to the Velinari court without an apology already prepared in advance, sent one instead with no apology at all, and reported back, with visible disbelief, that they had not been punished for it. Ythrenia faced resistance for this shift long after the ink on our treaty had dried. Members of her own court, raised the same way she had been raised, on the assumption that mercy shown to one species would be read as weakness by all the others, pushed back hard against every reform she attempted. I learned later, through occasional messages that passed between us in the months that followed, that she fought that resistance the same way I had once faced down a spear at my throat, calmly, deliberately, without flinching from the cost of standing her ground. "They call me reckless," she wrote to me once, months after the treaty was signed. "They say I have weakened the empire by treating a lesser species as an equal. I tell them the empire was never strong to begin with, only feared, and that fear is a debt that eventually comes due. I do not know if they believe me yet. But I notice, more and more, that fewer envoys arrive prepared to kneel before they have even heard the terms being offered. I thought often, in the months after, about that first night in the throne room, the spear close enough to feel its heat, the silence that followed my single word of refusal. I had not felt brave in that moment. I had felt, more than anything, like a man standing at the edge of something he could not see the bottom of, choosing to step forward anyway because the alternative felt worse than falling. It turned out that single step had done more than protect one mining agreement in the Varen Belt. It had cracked something open across an entire region of space that had operated the same way for longer than human civilization had existed at all. Not because I was especially wise, or especially strong, or especially prepared for what I was walking into, simply because refusing to kneel was, for me, and for most of the people I had grown up among, not really a choice at all. It was closer to instinct, the same instinct that had walked people out of unfair contracts, unjust courts, and impossible demands throughout every chapter of our history, long before any of us had ever imagined we would one day carry that instinct out among the stars. I still think, sometimes, about what Withrenia asked me in that quiet room by the windows, what I would have done if her guards had struck me down the moment I turned my back. I gave her an honest answer that day, and I still believe it now. I would have turned around anyway, because there are things worse than losing everything, and being the first chapter of a species that kneels the moment the pressure gets heavy enough was one of them. They expected me to beg. They had seen 100 envoys before me do exactly that, and they assumed I would be the 101st. Instead, I turned around and walked out, into a corridor I did not know led anywhere at all, carrying nothing but the certainty that some things are worth more than the safety that comes from bending. Humans don't beg, not because we are stronger than everyone else out here, or braver, or wiser. We simply walk away from what should never have been offered to us in the first place, and somewhere out among all those ancient, careful, fear-built empires, someone always ends up chasing after us, wondering, for the first time, if there might have been a better way all along.